Racist cop assaults black woman in courtroom. Her calm response breaks him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's return to our main character. The morning sun filtered weakly through the courthouse windows, casting pale lines across the polished floor as people shuffled into their seats with the weary familiarity of another long trial day. At the center of the room, Officer Bradley Cole stood with the rigid posture of a man who believed the badge on his chest placed him above everyone else. His eyes, sharp with impatience, swept across the courtroom until they landed on the woman he had decided did not belong there. Aaliyah Brooks sat quietly near the witness stand, her posture upright, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her expression carried a calmness so steady it unsettled even those who didn't know her. Her dark hair framed a face composed, not of fear, but of something far more controlled. An inner stillness forged through years of learning when to speak and when silence could shake the ground beneath someone. The courtroom hummed with low whispers, the kind people shared when they sensed tension but pretended not to notice. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, adding a cool sharpness to the already strained air. Officer Cole stepped closer, his boots echoing louder than necessary, as if each step was meant to remind everyone who commanded the room. But Aaliyah didn't flinch. She didn't shift. Her eyes remained steady, tracing the lines of the room as though she were studying something far bigger than the trial itself. Imagine sitting there, feeling the weight of 100 assumptions pressing against your shoulders, and still choosing to breathe with unbroken grace. That was Aaliyah. Around them, the judge adjusted his glasses without lifting his gaze. The jury fiddled with notepads. Attorneys exchanged quiet remarks. It was an ordinary courtroom on an ordinary day, or at least it should have been. But something in the air carried an unspoken electricity, the kind that forms seconds before lightning touches ground. Officer Cole hovered near her now, clearly irritated by her composure. His voice dropped into a tone meant to intimidate. Yet her calm only grew stronger, as if absorbing his aggression and transforming it into something immovable. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she breathed slowly, her shoulders easing into a stillness that drew attention without force. And that stillness unsettled him more than any words could have. People began to watch, not openly, but in the quiet way eyes drift when they sense a shift in power, subtle yet inevitable. Aaliyah's presence, her calm, her refusal to match his hostility, began to reshape the atmosphere. The courtroom, built on decades of tense histories and heavy judgments, suddenly felt like the place where something different was taking shape. It was the kind of moment where truth didn't need volume to be heard. It simply needed to stand. And that was exactly what she did. The tension inside the courtroom thickened like air before a storm, subtle yet unmistakable, as Officer Bradley Cole lingered far too close to Aaliyah Brooks. His frustration continued to simmer just beneath the surface, tightening his jaw and sharpening the edge in his voice. It was as if her calmness drew out every insecurity he carried, exposing them one quiet breath at a time. Aaliyah remained composed, her gaze steady on the judge's bench, choosing silence over confrontation. Her stillness created a strange contrast against the restless energy filling the room, and people began to sense that something deeper was unfolding. Imagine standing there, knowing every eye is watching, waiting to see whether you will bend or remain unshaken. Aaliyah's poise was not defiance. It was dignity held with both hands, a quiet reminder that strength does not always need to rise in volume. Near the jury box, a few members exchanged glances, sensing the imbalance between the officer's impatience and the woman's unwavering restraint. Even the attorneys paused their whispered conversations, their attention drawn to the charged stillness hovering between them. The judge cleared his throat, his expression shifting as though he finally recognized the scrutiny forming around the moment. The fluorescent lights flickered softly overhead, illuminating the subtle tremor in Officer Cole's stance. He was trying to hold on to the authority that usually went unquestioned, yet was slipping through his fingers as the room's energy shifted. Toward the woman he had underestimated. Aaliyah adjusted her posture, her fingers grazing the small notebook she carried, not to provoke, but simply to ground herself. The gesture was gentle, deliberate, and oddly disarming. It drew attention not because it was dramatic, but because it was calm in the exact place where calm should not have been possible. She lifted her eyes, meeting the officer's stare with a look so steady that a hush rippled through the observers. It was the kind of look that said, without a single spoken word, that truth stands strongest when it stands quietly. Officer Cole stepped back just half an inch, but enough for anyone watching closely notice. His confidence wavered, not because she had challenged him outwardly, but because she had refused to crumble the way he expected. The judge raised his gavel a fraction, hesitating as though he sensed he no longer controlled the rhythm of the room. The attorneys sensed it too, their pens frozen above their notepads. And in that half-second of suspended breath, the entire courtroom seemed to shift around Aaliyah instead of the officer who believed he ruled it. She inhaled softly, her voice finally breaking the silence with a calmness so controlled it felt like a mirror being held up to everyone present. The words were simple, carried without anger, yet they landed with a clarity that rippled through the air. "I am ready when the court is." There was no challenge in her tone, no plea, no bitterness. Just truth stated with quiet certainty. And somehow, that single sentence carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Those watching felt the ground subtly tilt, as though the story they thought they understood was beginning to rewrite itself right before their eyes. In that moment, it became unmistakably clear. The calmest person in the room was the one holding all of its gravity. A subtle shift moved through the courtroom the moment Aaliyah Brooks spoke, as if her calm response had reached into the very foundation of the room and steadied it. People who had been half listening now leaned in without realizing it, drawn by something they could not quite explain. Officer Bradley Cole stiffened, his shoulders rising a fraction as he fought to reclaim a sense of authority that felt suddenly fragile. It was not what she said that unsettled him. It was how she said it, with a composed certainty that did not match the narrative he had built in his mind. The judge adjusted the papers before him, trying to resume the rhythm of the proceeding, but his gaze lifted just slightly toward Aaliyah, as though seeing her with new eyes. Even the court reporter paused before continuing to type, sensing the delicate rearrangement of power taking place. As the attorney approached with a stack of documents, he hesitated for a brief moment, acknowledging Aaliyah with a respectful nod that had not existed minutes earlier. She acknowledged him with a gentle tilt of her head, still poised, still steady. Imagine witnessing someone hold firm in a room designed to test resolve at every turn. Her presence carried that rare quality, a stillness that did not demand attention, but commanded it all the same. Across the room, a few spectators exchanged whispers, questioning what they might have overlooked. They noticed the slight shimmer of a polished emblem tucked discreetly inside her notebook, the subtle confidence in her posture, the way she navigated the moment without even a trace of fear. Officer Cole noticed too. His eyes narrowed, not in anger this time, but in uncertainty. He stepped back from the witness stand, attempting to mask the hesitation in his movements. His voice, when he spoke, lacked the same firmness it had held earlier. The judge called for the next phase of the hearing, but the atmosphere had changed so dramatically that even routine instructions seemed different, carried on a current shaped by everything unspoken. Aaliyah opened her notebook, the crisp sound of the page turning echoing more loudly than it should have. She made a small note with a pen, her handwriting deliberate and precise. It was not an act of defiance, but rather the natural action of someone who understood exactly where she stood and what she intended to document. The attorney cleared his throat and continued questioning, But each answer Aaliyah offered was delivered with clarity and thoughtfulness, each word serving as a quiet reaffirmation of her depth and composure. She did not rush. She did not waver. Her voice held a calm steadiness that seemed to stretch into every corner of the courtroom. The jury watched her differently now. Their pens moved more carefully across their notepads, their expressions shifting with each measured response she gave. Even the bailiff at the back of the room straightened slightly, as though adjusting to the new tone she had set. Officer Cole folded his arms, but the gesture looked more like a shield than authority. He kept glancing toward Aaliyah, each time revealing a flicker of something he had not expected to face: doubt. And in that doubt, the courtroom felt the beginning of a turn, a slow but unmistakable unraveling of the assumptions made about the woman who sat with such quiet strength. The moment did not need drama to be powerful. It simply needed truth, and truth has a way of reshaping a room without ever raising its voice. The energy within the Richmond courtroom continued to tighten, as if every breath in the room had begun to sync with the subtle shifts radiating from Aaliyah Brooks. The judge attempted to maintain the tempo of the proceedings, yet his voice carried a faint hesitation that suggested he was no longer entirely certain of the ground beneath him. Attorney Michael Harris stepped forward with a file in hand, pausing before addressing Aaliyah, his tone measured with a level of respect that had been absent at the start of the hearing. Her calm presence had changed the room, and individuals who had overlooked her moments earlier now found themselves recalibrating their assumptions. Aaliyah answered each question with a steady cadence, her words offered thoughtfully, each one like a stone placed deliberately to build a foundation of clarity. Nothing in her tone suggested frustration or defensiveness. Instead, she seemed to guide the truth forward with an ease that softened the tension while simultaneously sharpening awareness. Imagine watching someone who does not need to raise a voice or lift a hand to shift the balance of an entire room. That was the quiet strength unfolding in real time. Officer Bradley Cole stood several feet away, arms folded in a posture that had begun to feel less commanding and more like a shield held in uncertainty. His eyes moved between Aaliyah and the judge, trying to interpret an outcome he had not anticipated. The authority he had leaned on so confidently at the beginning of the morning was slipping, not through confrontation, but through the steady, undeniable contrast between his reactions and hers. The jury continued taking notes, but now with an attentiveness that captured every nuance in Aaliyah's responses. A few jurors even exchanged subtle glances, recognizing the growing imbalance between how she carried herself and the assumptions previously cast over her. Aaliyah glanced briefly toward her notebook again, as if confirming a detail before she spoke. As she shifted it slightly, the faint metallic edge of a concealed emblem glimmered beneath the courtroom lights. It was barely visible, yet noticeable enough to raise the eyebrows of those closest to her. They did not know what it meant, but they understood instinctively that it hinted at something far beyond the role they believed she held. Officer Cole noticed it too. His breath caught ever so slightly, and he shifted his weight, suddenly less certain. The judge leaned forward, narrowing his eyes as if trying to decode the quiet but growing realization that this woman was not someone to be dismissed. As Attorney Harris asked his final question of the round, Aaliyah straightened her shoulders, her voice carrying a composed certainty that rippled through the courtroom. She did not embellish her statements or reach for emotion. Instead, she grounded each word in truth, offering facts with the ease of someone who understood precisely how the pieces of this moment fit together. When she finished speaking, a stillness settled over the room. No one rushed to fill it. No one attempted to disrupt it. It was as though the courtroom itself exhaled, acknowledging that the dynamic had shifted entirely. Even without revealing who she truly was, Aaliyah had begun to turn the tide. The more she remained calm, the more the truth of her strength became undeniable. And in the quiet that followed, it became clear that the person Officer Cole believed he could diminish was, in fact, the person reshaping everything he thought he controlled. Inside the Richmond District Courtroom, the air settled into a tense quiet that felt almost deliberate, as if every wall, every wooden bench, every flickering light sensed the shift taking place. Aaliyah Brooks sat with the same poised composure that had slowly unraveled assumptions and expectations throughout the morning. Her presence was no louder than before, yet its weight had become unmistakable. Every movement she made carried intention. Every breath seemed to steady the room. Attorney Michael Harris stepped back from the witness stand, collecting his papers with the careful precision of a man who had just realized the person before him was far more significant than he initially understood. His respect was no longer polite formality, it was earned recognition. The judge studied Aaliyah with narrowed eyes, not with suspicion, but with a dawning awareness. Something in her calm, something in the meticulous clarity of her responses, hinted at a depth of authority that did not come from happenstance. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. Imagine sitting in a room where truth does not arrive with force, but instead spreads quietly, reshaping perception with the gentlest of gestures. That was what Aaliyah was doing without ever lifting her voice. Officer Bradley Cole shifted uneasily at the edge of the courtroom, the badge on his chest catching the overhead lights. Earlier, he had stood with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the tone of any room he entered. Now, that tone had slipped entirely out of his hands. His arms, once folded tightly, slowly dropped to his sides, as if weighed down by an understanding he could not yet articulate. His gaze drifted repeatedly toward the small glimmer that had flashed from Aaliyah's notebook earlier. He pretended not to notice it, yet his attention kept circling back to that single moment, to the possibility that he had overlooked something of immense importance. A juror coughed softly, breaking the silence just enough for everyone to exhale. The courtroom reporter resumed typing with a little more care, as if chronicling a story whose outcome had begun to shift in a way no one had anticipated. Attorney Harris approached the bench for a procedural clarification, leaving Aaliyah momentarily without attention directed at her. It was in that quiet interlude that the room truly absorbed her presence. She reached in her notebook once more, turning a page with a calm and deliberate motion. The faint metallic shine appeared again, more visible this time. It was not a dramatic reveal, not bold or boastful. It was simply there, glinting beneath the fluorescent lights, carrying a message no one yet dared to define. But they all felt it. Even the judge's expression tightened subtly, and he cleared his throat as though preparing himself for a realization he could not fully grasp. Officer Cole swallowed hard. For perhaps the first time that morning, he looked genuinely uncertain. His breathing grew shallow, his stance less rigid. He watched the emblem's brief shimmer, as if it held the answer to the shift he had felt. Creeping into the courtroom since the moment Aaliyah first spoke, the attorney returned with a procedural update, but the energy of the room no longer followed him. It centered on Aaliyah, drawn in by her unspoken authority. When she finally looked up, her gaze swept gently across the courtroom, not challenging, not defiant, simply present with a confidence that required no explanation. Her voice, when she spoke again, carried that same steady warmth and clarity that had guided every word she offered. It did not rise or fall with emotion. It simply delivered truth. And truth, spoken with that level of quiet certainty, carried farther than any raised voice could. In that moment, the courtroom understood one thing clearly. The calmest person in the room was leading it, whether anyone had intended for her to or not. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Aaliyah Brooks continued to sit with the same steady composure that had begun to command the space. The subtle, growing realization had taken root across the room. The woman they had dismissed, the woman they had underestimated, was not just any witness. She was the center of a quiet storm that had shaken the assumptions of every person present. Officer Bradley Cole stood rigid, his gaze flickering between Aaliyah and the others in the room. His mouth was tight, and his hands, which had once been folded in a confident stance, now hung loosely at his sides. He tried to regain his composure, but the room no longer looked the same. The control he once held had slipped away in the quiet weight of Aaliyah's presence. The jury watched her with a different intensity now. Their attention no longer split, but focused entirely on the woman before them. Each juror scribbled notes, some with pens moving faster than before, others looking up only to meet her calm gaze before returning to their work. Aaliyah didn't need to speak loudly, didn't need to argue, or even raise her voice. She simply needed to be present, and in doing so, she shifted the entire atmosphere. The judge, once simply observing, now sat forward, his hands resting on the wooden desk before him as he took in the proceedings with new clarity. His earlier indifference seemed to have vanished, replaced by an awareness that Aaliyah was not a mere participant in this trial, but someone whose presence altered the very course of the room. Attorney Michael Harris, who had been moving between his papers and the judge, now paused when he caught Aaliyah's eye. His pace slowed, as if reflecting on what he had failed to see earlier. There was a quiet realization that Aaliyah was not simply a bystander in this trial. She was a force of nature in her own right. The subtle shine from the emblem in her notebook had not gone unnoticed, and though no one spoke of it directly, it hung in the air like an unspoken truth. For a moment, Officer Cole glanced away, trying to reset himself, but Aaliyah's calm gaze was never far from his line of sight. It was a reminder that even without revealing her identity, she held a quiet power that had already begun to break down the walls that once shielded his arrogance. The trial proceeded, but something had fundamentally shifted. The tension was no longer one-sided. Aaliyah had not only stood her ground, but in her silence, she had turned the tables, shifting the weight of the room toward her. No one spoke of it directly, but everyone felt it. The balance of power had subtly, but decisively, moved away from Officer Cole and toward the woman who had been wronged. She had not fought with words or force. She had fought with the one thing that no one could take away from her, her unwavering, quiet dignity. And in the process, she had earned the respect of everyone in the room, whether they were ready to acknowledge it or not. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression now one of quiet consideration. It was clear that the trial was no longer just about the case at hand. It was about something larger, something that could not be ignored any longer. The room was about to learn a new lesson, one that didn't come from loud declarations or emotional outbursts. It came from the steady, calm presence of a woman who knew exactly who she was. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted irrevocably. Aaliyah Brooks sat poised at the witness stand, the weight of the room's attention on her without her needing to exert a single ounce of force. Officer Bradley Cole stood several feet away, his stance now visibly less assured. The tension that had once been one-sided was now palpably shared by everyone present. The spectators, the jury, the attorneys, and even the judge were aware of the subtle, yet powerful change that had occurred. What had started as an ordinary day in court was transforming into something much more significant. The quiet power emanating from Aaliyah was undeniable, and the fact that it came without any show of force or aggression made it all the more remarkable. In this moment, Aaliyah had not only taken command of the room, but had shown that true strength lies not in raising one's voice, but in the ability to remain centered, unshaken, and unwavering in the face of adversity. Attorney Michael Harris, who had once been the one to question her, now stood silently. His earlier confidence had been replaced with a quiet respect. His eyes flicked to the judge, then to Aaliyah, as if acknowledging that the balance of power had shifted. The judge, too, could no longer ignore the change. His posture was more rigid now, his eyes fixed on Aaliyah as though seeing her for the first time. There was an awareness in his gaze, as if he had just realized that this case was no longer just about the legal proceedings at hand. It was about something much deeper. Aaliyah had demonstrated that even in a space built on rules and authority, there were still moments where the truth could be revealed in the most unassuming ways. Officer Cole's discomfort grew with each passing second. The glimmer of the emblem that had briefly caught the light earlier lingered in his mind. It was a detail he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. He was no longer certain of his own position in the room. For the first time since the trial began, he was questioning whether he had misjudged the situation entirely. The energy in the room had become thicker, charged with an unspoken recognition that Aaliyah was not the woman he had once thought her to be. And yet, there she sat, as calm and composed as ever. Her confidence was not rooted in the desire to prove anything. It was simply the result of knowing exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Aaliyah's words, when she finally spoke, were measured and clear, yet they carried a weight that seemed to hang in the air long after they were spoken. She wasn't trying to change anyone's mind or to challenge authority. She was simply stating the facts. And in doing so, she was unraveling the web of assumptions that had been built around her, exposing the fragility of the power dynamics that had once seemed so solid. Officer Cole shifted again, his hand instinctively reaching for the edge of his belt. It was a reflex, born of his long training and experience, but betrayed him nonetheless. Aaliyah's gaze flicked briefly in his direction, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. No words were exchanged, but in that fleeting moment, something unspoken passed between them. Aaliyah had not only changed the course of the trial, she had begun to rewrite the rules of engagement in this courtroom. The tension was no longer about the case at hand. It was about something much larger, the quiet dismantling of assumptions, the steady reclaiming of power, and the truth that could no longer be ignored. The courtroom fell into a profound silence as the realization settled over everyone. Aaliyah Brooks had not only asserted control of the room, but had done so without uttering a single word of defiance or anger. Officer Bradley Cole, who had once stood with the belief that his badge and authority made him untouchable, now found himself unsure of his next move. His gaze shifted from the judge to the attorneys and finally to Aaliyah, who sat with a calm that could not be ignored. It was as though every step he had taken to assert his dominance in this space had only served to draw attention to his own vulnerability. And still, Aaliyah remained unmoved. Her stillness had a force to it that nothing in the courtroom could disrupt. The judge, who had been distant and unyielding earlier, now looked at her with a new awareness. His eyes met hers briefly before he returned to the proceedings, but there was a shift in his expression. He could no longer pretend that Aaliyah was simply another witness in a long list of faces he had encountered throughout his career. She had become the focal point of the trial in a way that none of them had expected. Attorney Michael Harris, who had been busy gathering documents, now hesitated. He glanced at Aaliyah, then at the judge, before returning to his papers, his mind clearly occupied with something he had not considered before. The weight of her calm, her quiet authority, was taking root, and it was hard to ignore. The atmosphere in the room had transformed from one of procedural routine to something more tense, more purposeful. It was not just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning. Aaliyah did not need to shout or wave her hands to be heard. Every word she spoke was measured, thoughtful, and direct. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't raise her temper. She simply spoke the truth, as if letting it unfold with the quiet elegance that only she possessed. The jury, which had previously been distracted, now listened intently. Each word she said seemed to carry more weight than the last, as though the power she had quietly exerted over the courtroom had seeped into every corner of their minds. And with that, they were no longer just observers. They were participants in the story that Aaliyah had begun to write in the room. Officer Cole, now unable to hide his unease, took a slow step back. His hand, which had been resting at his side, clenched into a fist, as if trying to grasp some sense of the situation that had slipped through his fingers. But no matter how hard he tried, the reality of what was happening became clearer with each passing moment. The woman he had once disregarded, the woman he had treated as inconsequential, was now the one determining the course of this trial. His position in the courtroom had shifted, and there was no going back. It was no longer a matter of who held the power. It was a matter of who could wield it, and Aaliyah had already proven, through her quiet strength, that she was the one who would decide the outcome. The room was filled with an unspoken understanding. The trial was no longer about who was right or wrong. It was about the undeniable force of truth and the quiet power of a woman who had earned her place in a space that was never meant for her to inhabit. As the next set of questions were brought forward, Everyone in the room knew. The moment of reckoning had arrived. The courtroom, once buzzing with the tension of a typical trial, had now transformed into a space of quiet expectation. Each individual in the room, whether they were a spectator, a juror, or an attorney, felt the weight of the moment. Aaliyah Brooks had not just participated in this trial. She had taken control of it. The subtle shift in the room had been gradual, but it was undeniable. Officer Bradley Cole, who had once stood with the confidence of a man who believed his badge alone commanded respect, now found himself standing in the shadows of his own uncertainty. The look of disbelief that had crossed his face earlier had not faded. His posture, which had been a testament to authority just hours before, was now stiff and uncertain. He was no longer the figure of unquestioned power in the courtroom. That power, in the most unexpected of ways, had shifted to Aaliyah. The room, once filled with the whispers of doubt and judgment, was now silent, hanging on every word she spoke. Her calmness, her unwavering poise, had rendered the space around her still. Aaliyah spoke again, but this time there was no need for her words to carry the weight of a challenge. She had already made her presence known. The truth, which had once been obscured by the chaos of the trial, now stood clear and undeniable. The judge, who had previously shown indifference, was now watching her with a quiet regard. His eyes no longer darted between papers, but stayed fixed on Aaliyah. It was as if he too had finally understood the gravity of the situation. Aaliyah had not just been a bystander. She had been the one pulling the strings, orchestrating a turn of events that no one had anticipated. The jury, once passive observers, were now visibly engaged. Their pens moved more carefully across their notepads, their eyes no longer glossing over the words, but absorbing every detail. Each one of them, in their own way, was realizing that the woman on the stand was not just another victim or witness. She was a force to be reckoned with. And even if they didn't yet fully understand the depth of her influence, they knew enough to acknowledge that something monumental had occurred. Officer Cole's unease grew with every passing moment. He no longer appeared as the confident officer who had stepped into the courtroom, ready to dismiss Aaliyah with the same arrogance he had used on countless others. His gaze kept drifting toward her, not with the hostility he had once shown, but with something else, perhaps the realization that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The entire courtroom seemed to understand that this was not just a trial about legalities. It had become a battle of power, of perception, and ultimately of truth. And Aaliyah was winning it without even raising her voice. As the trial continued, it became clearer to everyone that the day had shifted in her favor. The finality of her quiet strength, the way she had managed to maintain her composure while others had faltered, left a lasting impression. And in that moment, the room knew what it had not known before. Aaliyah Brooks was not just the center of this trial. She was its force, its turning point, its defining factor. The courtroom had never seen anything like it. It would never forget the quiet power of the woman who had changed everything.